Stan Christiansen, thank you so much for taking the time to be here. It's wonderful to reconnect with you.
Great to be here.
Well, the world is filled with conflict. We see it every day in the news. We see it in the conflict in the Middle East. We see it in Ukraine. We see it in the tension in Taiwan. We see it in the larger economic shifts that are going on. And in a world so filled with conflict and tense incentives, it'd be awesome to have a conversation with you about the subject matter that you're an expert on, and that's negotiation. So, why don't we start with a bit of background? Tell us a bit about your story and how negotiations is the through line. Um,
Yeah, I stumbled on it. I'd like to say that I was strategic about a career in negotiation, but it just wasn't that way. I was in graduate school at Harvard. I was in my second year of business school, and I was a little disenfranchised with the typical banks and consulting firms that were coming to interview at Harvard, and just committed not to do a job that I wasn't passionate about. So I didn't do any interviewing second year of business school for jobs. And I met a professor at a party in Cambridge, Massachusetts, who introduced to me the Harvard Negotiation Project, the book Getting to Yes, Roger Fisher, the professor. And I just got sucked into that world. And so in 1991, when I finished business school, I went to work at one of the consulting arms of the Harvard Negotiation Project, which was essentially doing the applied work that was coming into Harvard Law School around negotiations. So those were things like political conflict, ethnic conflict, hostage negotiations, a lot of corporate work. There was a lot of negotiation in corporate life. And so did that full time for about 10 years and traveled extensively. It was in about 75 different countries doing different kinds of negotiation. And so that was the entree. And everything since then has been impacted by those 10 years.
and well, it's a fascinating world, and I got to hear some of the stories that you told. Not only in class, because I took the negotiation class you taught, which was fantastic, but also randomly at home when we met for the first time, by one of those coincidences of fate, where I met you at my parents' house in Asuncion, Paraguay, of all places, and you were telling us a bit about that story. And some of these tools that we learned in class have been so profoundly useful for my personal life, for my relationships, for my professional life, and job negotiations, salary negotiations, that it'd be so awesome to revisit them with you. And I want to hear how you think about this little toolbox that you've built and how sort of it's affected your life, not only in the period of time where you were traveling a lot and from one crisis situation to another, but also in the later stages and maybe even the current stages.
Yeah, cut me off if I'm going on too long because that the response to that would be at least an hour, and we don't have that amount of time. Let me just hit a couple bullet points and then take me the direction you want. So it's impacted everything. Let's just maybe put a definition on negotiation because that means a lot of things to different people. I define it as any attempt to persuade or influence another person. And so if you define it that broadly, it really is a skill that is used for sure daily and often more often than not. Few of us go through a day where we're not trying to influence someone to do something or someone else is trying to influence us. So it's permeated. It's ubiquitous. It's part of everything that I do. An example of that is after my 10 years doing full-time negotiation work, I had several jobs, but one of them was to start an investment bank that would help entrepreneurs who were either raising capital or selling their companies. It turns out that negotiation plays a large role in those two functions, primarily because the valuations and the terms are so subjective. And so, if you take an example of selling a company, particularly in the space that you've worked in technology, on a given day, a company could be worth $50 million or $500 million, depending on the negotiation. It really is that subjective. So I started a firm called Arbor Advisors that was an investment bank for entrepreneurs. And what we would do is negotiate on behalf of those entrepreneurs. And so it's kind of taking my negotiation skills and putting them on the entrepreneur's side of the ledger. And it turns out that very few people are good negotiators. Why is that? Why, in a skill that is so important, persuasion and influence, are people not good at it naturally? And a couple reasons. One is there isn't very good training. Most, even most university and graduate level courses in negotiation tend to deal with tactics. So, how do you take advantage of the other side? How do you divide a fixed pie and get more for you and less for them? And it turns out that most negotiations aren't that simple. Most relationships are with other people who you're going to have a continued relationship over a long period of time. And so just extracting value through a tactic not only damages the relationship, but makes it harder to expand the pie, build the relationship over time. And so, if I were going to give one metaphor for what negotiation is, it's joint problem solving for mutual benefit. And that's just not
Mm.
how the world thinks of it. And that's why we get stuck in these zero sum games. It's why when we look at any conflict, I mean, there are a lot of conflicts, and you alluded to this, whether it's Palestine, Israel, whether it's Ukraine, Russia, we look at those as win lose, who's taking territory, who's losing territory. And of course, the dynamics are much more complex. And we could dive into those or any other that you want to talk about today. But think of it as an essential language that few people speak. So if you speak it just a little bit, you can be very valuable in your relationships and any organizational work you do.
There's a bullet point there that I want to double click onto. That is which was the same idea that you convinced, you portrayed the very first class. That is this redefinition of negotiation and this idea of just prioritizing the continued interaction over the transactional, one shot game where you can default to all these like prisoner's dilemma type of situations, and you end up reacting in the worst possible way. Um, so there's a pitch to be made. There's a lot of the world, it seems, has operated under this assumption of finite resources and property rights or ownership rights to those resources. And like, even though technology can create more resources, or you can organize those resources to provide more plenty for more people, there does still, somewhere mythologically, it's still very embedded in our psyche that it's either yours or mine. So how do we steelman the case for this new way of thinking, or this like different way of thinking about negotiation, and try and convey to people the dramatic, almost like exponential difference that there can be in futures where we work together versus in futures where we are each individually clawing at each other.
Yeah, the answer, not surprisingly, coming from your former professor, is education. The only way to
Mm,
change people's mind is to give them the tools. Let me give a little bit more complex answer because it's easy, but there are. We can talk about books, we can talk about frameworks, we
mm,
can talk about examples of good negotiators, and so there are a lot of ways to learn. Um, but I think that the most important thing is first questioning the assumptions that people make about what successful negotiation is. Let me give you some examples. A lot of people will say a successful negotiation is if you got the other side to give concessions. The classic one
mm,
that everyone points to is car dealers. People will come to me. Stanford students used to come to me and
mm,
still do. Probably next semester when I'm teaching, some Stanford student will come to me and say, "Hey, professor, I've got to tell you about this story. I went and negotiated with this car dealer and I just did phenomenally well. Let me tell you about like my process, the outcome. It was unbelievable." So in 22 years of teaching at Stanford, Christian, how often do you think I heard that student's story and thought, "Oh, the poor car dealer. That young bright kid at Stanford just took advantage of him. Oh gosh, I feel so bad for the car dealers." And so why is that? Why did the car dealer do better? And why have I never heard a good story about that? It's because car dealers have certain tactics that they use. And the reason they use them is that they work, right? They try to get people to anchor on a
mhm,
price. And then once they have anchored, they might give
mm,
20 concessions. But if the anchor is at the wrong point, it's still not necessarily going to be an objective outcome. And
mhm,
I'm sure you don't remember some of the tools that we taught in those days of your class on how you overcome that. But people want to play games.
mhm,
Years ago, General Motors had a Saturn car. It was named Saturn, and one of their big things was no negotiation, fixed price. And everyone
mm,
was very relieved when they came out with that because people don't like. People thought that people don't like
mhm,
negotiating with car dealers, but it turned out that the market research said no, people don't want the fixed price. They want to go in. and negotiate and feel like they did well. And so another way that people measure success is, did I win? Did I do well? And there usually isn't a simple win-lose in negotiations. Very few negotiations in your life are like negotiating for a car, where it might be a one-time purchase with a person you won't see again, yet people behave that way. So first thing we need to do is get people to question their assumptions about what negotiation is, how success is measured, and then if you can get them over those two hurdles, teach them frameworks that help them to actually prepare for a negotiation, think about how to conduct a negotiation, and that's where the teaching comes in.
Hmm. And I remember some of the tools. Like I remember the basics of, knowing where you stand before entering a negotiation and sort of taking stock of your internal assets, and obviously the very famous BATNA, the best alternative to negotiated agreement. And sort of that lets you know where in the map you fall as you begin to travel it. I remember BATNA. What else was adjacent to BATNA that we can explore on from there?
Well, let's use your career, because your listeners, I'm sure, are interested in your career. So, um, one of your jobs, I recall, was to work at Google. Okay, you
Hmm.
went to work at Google. Now, when you went to work at Google, were there other companies you were considering?
There were, yes.
Who were the top alternatives? What would have, if you couldn't get that job at Google, where might you have worked?
I think I would have enjoyed going to Microsoft. Sorry, to Facebook. I think was the
Facebook.
other
Okay.
one that I.
Yeah, and so that's a very typical one. Same geography, and work with some of the same kinds of people. Both probably be good experiences in different ways. So let's say that Google is your first choice. It's really useful to know what your backup plan is. If Google doesn't work out, do you have a job at Facebook? What do they pay at Facebook? What are the non-financial terms of employment at Facebook? So that when you go in and you negotiate with maybe an HR person at Google, and you say, look, I've done some market research. People are paying $250,000 for product managers at Facebook. You guys are offering me 175. Gosh, I don't want to be, a greedy, entitled Stanford student thinking they always earn more. I just want to be paid what's fair. And Facebook's paying more than you guys. How do you account for that? How did you guys come to the 175? So that would be an example of both thinking about objective criteria on what's fair and making your alternatives better. If you've got that offer at
Mm,
Facebook, when you walk into Google, your BATNA, the term you used, or an acronym standing for best alternative to a negotiated agreement, if you have your BATNA in your back pocket, that gives you power in the negotiation,
mm,
makes you feel confident. Where if Google's the only company that you're talking to and they give you an offer for $150,000, you might be tempted to just take it because all your marbles, are in that basket. And so you want to think in salary negotiations about what your alternative is and benchmark based on alternatives, and bring in the data or the objective criteria and be paid what's fair. It's very hard to say in a job interview, look, I'm not looking for the last dollar in this negotiation, but I do want to be paid fairly. And
mhm,
I've talked to 6 other companies, and here's the range of what they pay. And you guys are kind of on the low end of that or below the low end of that. And so let's figure out if there's a fair way. Because my first choice is to go to Google. I really want to be
mm.
here. But I've got student loans. If someone else is paying me $75,000 less for the same job, it's going to be a harder choice. So that's a sophisticated way to negotiate. An unsophisticated way would have been if you got that $175,000 offer and said, "Sorry, I want 250," and didn't use kind of fairness and objective criteria to back it up. And that sounds really basic, but very few people do that. Very few people bring in data and have done the market research to know what's fair. And these days, of course, it's easy to get that information.
And well, there's many layers there. There's the tact, the tactfulness of the approach. That is, hey, I'm aspiring towards this ideal of fairness, which I assume you aspire to too. Um, and so that's a very delicate way of saying, like I think my worth is more. And then there's also the sort of beginner's open mindedness to actually figuring out what is your worth. And that, oftentimes the BATNA is the most objective measure. Like evaluation for a company is based on the price that the people paid before. So there's like all these ways that we can sort of offload some of that worth. But in the 0 to 1 case, when you're applying to your first job and you don't have a BATNA and you don't have a how do you go from 0 to 1 in the sense of sort of like applying a philosophy of constantly developing BATNAs? And just being okay with that would be the first, because you can upgrade your BATNA and, like it can become a higher number, but the first one may be very low.
Yeah, let's talk about that. Number one, you always have a BATNA. It might not be attractive. So you might have gone to 6 other companies and had no offers, but there is some place to go. Let's say your BATNA is graduate school, or I take a year off and
Mm.
travel. Those are
Mm-hmm.
alternatives. They might not be attractive, but they're alternatives. So you really want to work on your BATNA and try to make it better so that you feel more confident. Okay, so that's the first
Mm.
point. I think that sometimes you want to make the other side's BATNA worse, right?
Mm.
Because if their alternative looks bad, they're more likely to be generous to you. Let's give an
Mm.
entrepreneurial example, sticking with your career. Um, Traditionally, investors, especially venture capitalists, the early stage investors, had a lot of power with entrepreneurs. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
capital for thousands of years has been in a powerful position. It
Mm.
turns out if you look at the last 10, 15 years, the leverage has shifted to entrepreneurs. Why is that? One is capital is cheap. It's easy to get
Mm.
capital. There's lots of capital. There are not a lot of great entrepreneurs with great ideas, or at least not as many as there are
Mm-hmm.
general partners at venture capital firms looking for capital. So the venture capitalists have done a great job of convincing entrepreneurs that their BATNA is bad. But in reality, um, if you're a successful entrepreneur or prospectively successful entrepreneur, um, the venture capitalist really needs you. You don't
Mm.
really need an individual venture capitalist. You need somebody to fund
Mm.
you, but there are thousands of venture capital firms. There are lots of non-venture capital sources, and entrepreneurs tend to not explore that as much, especially people in your shoes that spent time at Stanford or have worked in Silicon Valley feel like there's a formula for successful startups, and it always includes venture capital. But I would say in my career as an investment banker, there are just far more successful
Mm.
technology companies that aren't venture capital backed than there are. And so your BATNA
Mm.
venture money is to bootstrap it, other sources of capital. And so just an example to say that often we assume the other side has more leverage when maybe they don't. So you want to really reality test their BATNA and then develop your own, make it better.
Mm. And I think it's fascinating, and it begins to touch on these moral questions that you also helped us navigate around the ethics of making someone else's BATNA worse. And also sometimes the ethics of you improving a BATNA, even though you maybe don't need to. Like if there's a relationship that might be endangered, whether it could be commercial or personal or romantic, any kind of relationship, a relationship that may feel threatened by a better BATNA. What are the ethics of being in this constant state of improving the BATNA? And then there's the ethics of diminishing someone else's BATNA. Now, I do want to say that there's like tremendous amounts of nuance and individual cases that make it hard, very difficult for it to be cookie cutter. But what are some of the best practices that you've learned so far, having to deal with these impossible situations? Um,
Yeah, so we can come at that a couple different ways. On ethics, as they apply to BATNAs, people tend to lie about their BATNA, right? They tend to say, "Oh,
hmm,
I've got 5 other venture capital firms that have given me term sheets when they have none." Okay, that's an ethical breach. What I've told my students, my clients, my own behavior is never lie, and there are no exceptions. Okay, never lie, and there are no exceptions. Number one. So that's an ethical just standard, and if you're telling the truth or not. There are legal frameworks, so you never want to do anything that would be fraudulent legally. And I would say that that's a very low bar. So a lot of people um, basically comply with the law barely, and they have teams of attorneys saying, "Hey, you're crossing the line a little bit. You need to be a little bit further on the other side of the line." And I would say that's a low bar. I would say that I would suggest to anybody They raise their bar. And you need to decide yourself what standards you have. You can use the golden rule. You can use, there's just lots and lots of ethical
Hmm.
frameworks, but have them is the most important thing, rather than me prescribing what the ethical framework should be. Um, and I would say you do that for two reasons. One is it's good to have good morality. Um, and two is you make more money. If you treat people honestly and fairly, you do better over time. So let me give you an example from all the way back in the days when I was in graduate school. So I was doing an exercise out of class, and at Harvard Business School, they gave us too much work. And so you had to sort of parse through what you actually could do. And it was actually a negotiation exercise. And I arrived to the exercise, and the other student had done a ton of work. He had done a huge spreadsheet trying to figure out what the Nash equilibrium was, where we both came out really well in the negotiation. And I'd done very little preparation. And so he said to me, "Look, I've done all the work. I figured out where we both do really well. Why don't we just use the time we were going to use to negotiate and go play tennis?" I thought about it for a second. I thought, I really do need to play tennis. I'd really rather not do negotiation. Shouldn't be confessing this to a former student. But I said, okay, let's just go play tennis. Let's blow off the exercise. So we went and played tennis. The next day in class, there were 90 of us in class, and we had submitted our results, and the professor put the results up on, projected them up on the board. And of 90 students, I had the lowest point total in the class, and he had the highest point total in the class. So he had essentially used a tactic to take advantage of
Hmm.
it, convincing me that he was doing the fair thing, when in fact it was the most unfair negotiation in our entire class. Okay? So he won the battle. The reason he lost the war is I'm over 30 years out of business school. I'm telling you that story, and I will get even with David Robertson eventually. One of the few things I remember from business school is when you take advantage of people, they have long memories for it. Long,
Uh-huh.
long memories. The reason, one of the many reasons that the overreach that's going on right now in Gaza by the Israelis is such a mistake for their own interests, so advocating for their own interests. How long do you think the Palestinians and the Arab world in general is going to remember the kind of overreaction of the Israelis? And you might say that's subjective, but I would say that in that conflict, when you look at loss of life, which is somewhat objective, how many lives are lost, um, you know, a far disproportionate number of people have been killed in Gaza than were in Israel, and um, it's a complex question, but I think they're doing themselves a lot of damage, reputationally, practically, and so I think the country's going to prosper less because of what they're doing.
Hmm. And let's dive deep into the complexities of a situation like Israel and Palestine. Maybe not that one just because of how inflammatory it is in the world today, but some of the ones that you were on boots on the ground for. I remember you told the stories about Colombia and negotiating with Las FARC, and that's the stories, the effect of Las FARC, and the populist paramilitary groups. You feel the echoes of that in Paraguay growing up where I did. So let's talk about some of the the scenery, the senses of what it feels like to be in these negotiations that seem to be futile, even by even attempting feels futile.
Yeah, well, first of all, there are no non-negotiable situations. So there isn't any conflict in the world, previously or present, that couldn't be solved through negotiation. Number one, that's a deep belief I hold. It doesn't mean it's easy. It doesn't mean it's short term, but everything is negotiable. One of the problems you see in almost all these ethnic style conflicts, religious conflict, ethnic conflict, national conflict, is that people oversimplify and don't look at the complexity. So you bring up, there are three parties that you bring up in the Colombian situation. So I was working there in the early 90s quite a bit. And in the US, the media would have led you to believe that it's the drug lords versus the government. And of course, it
Mm.
was much more complex than that. Um, the guerrilla groups, FARC was one of many guerrilla groups, for example. The guerrilla groups were not united, they didn't communicate well with each other. This is pre internet. And so one of the things that we had to do is recognize that this term guerrilla was a little amorphous. And I defined it as just any people in Colombia who are unhappy with the government and using military means to express their unhappiness.
Mm.
Um, I sort of grew up thinking a guerrilla was someone in fatigues in a camp, and you get out there and you meet some of these guerrilla leaders, and you're like, hey, that guy's a lot like the guy I had dinner with last night in Bogota. There's just different
Mm.
interests. Number one. Number two, I would say that it was always easy in my work in conflict resolution to have a natural bias towards the disadvantaged party, and often there's a disadvantaged
Mm.
party. So if you're doing, as I did, labor management disputes, labor
Mm.
is often the disadvantaged party. They have less power.
Mm.
Um, in a situation in Colombia, what you had was you had people in the countryside who there was a very weak central government in those days. They weren't getting resources like water and electricity, and they were saying, "Hey, we're going to take this into our own hands. We don't want the government to be involved in our lives." The rich landowners would then hire the paramilitary groups that you talked about, and the government would sort of turn a blind eye to the human rights abuses of the paramilitary. So the paramilitary are hired
Mm.
guns by rich landowners to go kill guerrilla leaders or anyone who they were threatened by. And so the government said, hey, you're doing our work for us. And so they would just turn their head.
Mm.
And it took me a while in that conflict to realize that that was the real problem. And the paramilitary groups were difficult to negotiate with because it's all economic for them. They just want to get paid for killing
Mm.
people. Um, but that's the kind of thing that didn't make it into the media. And so our negotiations with paramilitaries ended up being the key to some of the successes that we had down there. Um, I think the important thing about that one is to recognize that it's very easy to demonize other people. So I have heard Israelis demonize Palestinians, and I have heard Palestinians demonize Israelis on a wholesale basis.
Mm.
Um, let's give an example here in our country. I have heard Republicans demonize Democrats, and vice versa. Democrats demonize Republicans in these very wholesale ways,
Mm.
and it's contributed to the polarization in our country. We're not doing a very good job, independent of where we are on the political spectrum, of negotiating, meaning persuading or influencing other people, right? We're kind of all
Mm.
dug in our camps. I was out on a hike in the mountains this morning, and I was trying to think of um, what can we do in this campaign to kind of bring people to the center. And my
Mm.
campaign slogan for either party would
Mm.
be, "Hey, I'm looking to govern for the 80% of the country that's closer to
Mm.
I'm never going to please the 10% on the extreme right. I'm never going to please the extreme left, but I'm governing for the 80%.
Mm.
Because I think that 80% is a big majority of the country. And so
Mm.
I do think there's a huge percent of that 80 that is looking for moderate solutions or
Mm.
solutions in general. Um,
Mhm.
we could discuss immigration. Like immigration, there is so much overlap between what the Republicans, the Democrats want on immigration. There is a bill in there.
Mhm.
It's not complicated, but politics are getting in the way. And so, is that a solvable
Mm.
problem? Of course. Why is it not getting solved? Because neither side has been effective at persuading the other. So that's a
Mm.
persuasion problem, not a policy problem. And so you can see how negotiation is a tool that helps to solve problems of all kinds. Um,
Mhm.
Individual family relationships, corporate relationships, national relationships, political relationships. And that's why I'm so passionate about
Mm.
it because it
Mhm.
does play in a lot of sandboxes.
Yeah, and I've come to appreciate this like more almost metaphysical view of negotiation too, where like the entirety of reality is this negotiation of forces. Right? There's this like these tensions that are just like deciding to coordinate in a certain way that we get to experience. And so like there's this negotiation happening at the molecular level, at the chemical level, at the atoms, like that are, trading ions and whatnot. And so it really is, like central to how I view the universe. But there's another layer there that I think is worth exploring, and it's connected to the thing you mentioned before about anchoring, where you tend to lose yourself or you tend to lose the main objective of the process by identifying with your anchored position. And you sort of tie that anchored position to your identity or to your dignity or your basic self-worth. And it's very hard to have flexibility about the world model when you find yourself in that position. this is what's going on. I think with like Republicans and Democrats. This is what's going on with Israel and Palestine. This is what's going on with Ukraine and Russia. It's like these coarse reductions of a very complex space, and they seem to be polar opposites. What were some of the techniques that we explored to identify when we're over anchoring or over indexing on a position that may not be the best, and how do we communicate that more broadly for people in their immediate relationships, but also in the aggregate, bigger, larger collective action situations?
Great questions. Let's explore it this way. What is an anchor? Why do people do it? How do you get them not to do it? And what's a more productive way to do it? Let's go in that order. An anchor is a position. It's like someone putting a stake in the ground. And they do that because they go into negotiations not as joint problem solving exercises, but to try to get something that they have preconceived is the right solution for their own interests. Okay? Why is that a bad idea? It's a bad idea because it's essentially saying there's nothing I could learn from the other person that would change what I think is a good outcome. Okay?
Hmm.
So I just want to bring them closer to my view of the world. But it turns out that if you genuinely go in to a negotiation hoping to learn new things from the other side that might create results that are better for both sides than your original anchor, that's joint problem solving. And most
Hmm.
negotiations fit into that category. Remember that if you're just talking about price and it's a commodity product and it's a one-time thing,
Hmm.
maybe anchoring works. I'd still argue that it doesn't, but maybe. But that's 99.5% of your negotiations aren't going to be that. So don't get stuck on anchoring when it's less than 1% of the time that could even be effective. It's number one. Number two, it's hard to be creative. Once you start talking about, and anchoring is usually around money, price. Once you start talking about that, it's very, very hard to talk about other things and be more creative. Let's go back to salary negotiations and your job at Google.
Hmm.
So, what were some of the things that you cared about in addition to salary
Hmm.
about a possible package and your employment there?
Hmm.
Was there anything, or was it just I'm a hired gun, I want to maximize the amount of money I make?
There were technical considerations. I mean, there was visa sponsoring
Okay.
stuff,
So
and so that favored big companies to a large degree. There was a sense of uncertainty in terms of where I was going to be located, and so I wanted a place that would have multiple offices that I could relocate to if necessary. Um, those I think were the basic ones. There were nice to haves on top, but those were like the very informing the course of my life type of frameworks.
that's perfect. Other things that you might have cared about, if you're like most people your age working at Google, were what's your project you're going to work on, who's your boss,
Mm,
what's the mobility, vacation schedule, work-life balance hours. There's a bunch of stuff in addition to those big ones that you mentioned that most people care about. And so it is extremely difficult to negotiate over those kind of things if you come in and say, I'm worth more and put an anchor on what you're worth. Okay. It's
mhm,
much easier to put off things like what the salary is until after you've worked through some of those sort of secondary issues. Yet people tend to just measure success by what salary they got. And so in your
mm,
case, you've got a company that's going to sponsor you, has multiple locations in the countries that you want to do. The role is good. You like your boss. That's sounding pretty good. And you might even take a job that's a little lower on the salary if you care about those things. And so think of anchoring as taking away from the process of creativity and joint problem solving and looking holistically. Let's do a
mm,
political analog. Um, we've got a lot of one issue voters in this country.
mm,
And pick your issue. A lot of people
mm,
vote based on one issue. Why is that a bad thing? It's a bad thing because everyone's interests are more complex than one issue. Okay?
mm,
And if you vote on that one issue, the candidate that you support may be completely morally opposed to the next six things in your list of priorities for a president. And so it's dangerous to focus and anchor on one issue politically. We have to learn through civics that the world is complex and we have to choose candidates that are looking holistically at the good of public service in the country. And I think that's been a really dangerous trend in our country to pick one issue and choose a
mm,
candidate based on your issue. I think, it's a little bit away from our topic today, but I think the reason people do that is it's easy. It's easy
Mm,
to be on Instagram, see a post, and say, "Yeah, that candidate's got my back on this issue. I don't have to think any harder than that." And so what we
mm.
want to do is train people to look at the world in a more complex way, like the book you
Yeah,
wrote.
it's almost there is almost like there's an impulse to be it's like a slogan or like a like these magic words that imply tribes, and we latch onto those like crazy. But I subscribe. I think there's an explosion of new ideas going on right now that I think is has become quite a bit of a challenge to the the structure of the world to figure out how to contain. And I think we're just increasing the dimensionality of how we look at problems, and like we know that it's very different now. And as you one of the things that I remember distinctly from the class was in the Columbia story, how the negotiation didn't seem to be moving anywhere, but there was a point where you got both leaders under the same, you just got them to talk for about an hour, and you check in a few hours later and they're in tears because they realize they have a completely unexpected connection, um, and that connection was something related to their daughters. And I think that like um, it's you can't have an informed model of the world unless you're like sort of aware of how different the boots on the ground sensation is from how we perceive it when it's digested by the machine and packaged into these one liner mantras uh, that we subscribe to and recite like like loyal ants, and but it's so there's the creative component too. There's also, I think there's a devilish thing that is like it's hard to notice when you're doing it yourself. Maybe easier if you just reduce to money, but when it comes to something like a position, like a one issue voter, you unless you go through the exercises of realizing what are my issues that are that I am ranking and prioritizing and all that stuff, you almost won't realize that you are a one issue voter. I mean, and I mean to generalize that not to just politics, but in general it's just your identity, you know. And whereas there's this much better version of the world that is like, wait a minute, I can always add more dimensions. How do we go um, from or how do I identify that we've fallen in the trap of a limited set of dimensions?
Yeah, I'm going to put a plug in for a book that I just read on this topic. The author is Yasha Monk, and it's called um, The Identity Trap. And
Hmm.
it's very current to talk about identity, and he does just the best job of this. Um, and I think the first thing we've got to do is recognize what our identities are and our influences are. So you may remember that when I teach a class at Stanford, the first thing I do, first day, is introduce myself and I state what some of my identities are. Not in an advocacy way or that those are good or bad, but just say, look, here's who I am. I'm a white male. I was born in Arizona. I went to Brigham Young University. I'm LDS. I served a church mission. I did negotiation. All those things impact who I am, some of it in ways I recognize and some of it in ways I don't recognize. And so, sort of understanding the lenses that you're looking through and that they are biased. Because of those identities, I have biases. And the really, people ask me all the time, I'll be at a cocktail party and they'll say, well, what are I'm never going to take your class. What are the three things or what are the five best
Hmm.
things that I learned about negotiation? Given, I don't give static answers to that because it's boring to just say the same
Hmm.
thing. But one consistent one over the years is people that can recognize the assumptions that they bring to the table. Okay. Some of those are identity related
Hmm.
and question those, not advocate for them, but question those. What am I missing? What do I have to learn from this situation? And that's one of the things that's missing in the US right now. Um, as you know, my family and I lived in France for the last year and put the kids in school there and had a great experience just living in a country that's very different from ours. And I'm very committed to the developing world, for example. Not that France is the developing world, but have traveled a lot. Not a coincidence at all that you and I met in Paraguay. That makes total sense to me. So I love visiting countries like that are dynamic and exciting and growing and all those kinds of things. But we have to sort of figure out what lenses we're looking through and how those bias us. So I'll say at a cocktail party, are you aware of your identities and the assumptions that those create? And some people are, but very few people go the next step, which is and question those assumptions that come
Mm,
from those identities. Can you actually question those? Not be in advocacy mode.
mm,
You know, we talk in class about balancing advocacy and
mm,
inquiry, but do you really understand? So in the last election, I was just curious. I was having a hard time seeing the appeal of Trump. I just couldn't
mm,
understand it. And most of that comes from my limited perspective. I'm a
mm,
white male, college educated person, and a lot of those people didn't vote for Trump, but a lot of people did vote for him. And so I said, "What is that?" And so I made it a real point to talk to Trump voters and just inquire, not advocate, not try to persuade, but help me understand why you voted for Donald Trump or are planning to. And it was an interesting exercise. I learned a lot. One of the things I learned is most of them weren't voting based on politics. So it wasn't policy, it
mm,
wasn't how we approach taxes or immigration or gun control or abortion or any of that. Those were not common answers. It was a lot of I'm dissatisfied with the economy, the culture, what's happening in the country, and so it was just very interesting. And I realized, well, you're never going to persuade a Trump voter using policy because that's not the lens
mm,
they're looking through. That's not what they care about. And so I think a thing that the Democratic Party has done a terrible job of is addressing legitimate underlying concerns of
mm.
people from the other party. And so rather than the lens I started with, which is these people maybe just don't understand politics or why are they voting against their interests, once I understood some of the underlying things, then I think, okay, now let's go to address those challenges and concerns.
Mhm. It's also like this deceptive machine to get easy wins, right? So if um, uh, I'm not trying to persuade the other person anymore. I'm just trying to feel good about how I feel. And so there's this trick where it's like this aversion to contact with reality that sort of keeps us in our own echo chambers. And I think conversations like these, I think there's a tidal change happening, and it's exciting to see where it goes. You mentioned the book. I remember the three books that we read in class, and I still have them to this day: "Getting to Yes," "Emotional Intelligence," and "Difficult Conversations." Do we want to give a little, best of about all three of them?
Wow. Again, you ask great questions. They're open ended, and it's hard to be concise in the response. I'll touch briefly on those books, and then I will. How many years ago did you take the class?
That was close to 10 years ago now.
Okay, so we've got some updated books these days, so I can
Ooh.
bring in some new ones as well. I still use. I always use Getting to Yes. Getting to Yes was written by Roger
Mm,
Fisher and Bill Urey, and Roger was my mentor at Harvard. And the book is a simple book. I highly recommend it. It was written in I think 1980, and so um, it's still on bestseller lists occasionally. I mean, so there are millions and millions of copies in print. I think there's a reason for that. It's simple, straightforward. You can read it in a few hours, and it teaches some basic principles. I'm going to list two or three rather than try to give a more complete review. One is that people's interests are often complementary and not in conflict.
mm,
We assume that we have conflicting interests with people, but if we kind of scratch beneath the surface and become good listeners, we can often find out that the things that people advocate often are based in needs, interests, desires, fears, hopes that we might not have known about ahead of time. And so if you can probe, he tells a fun example in that book that I'll just repeat quickly. So two sisters are fighting over an orange. They both want the orange. The mom enters the room as they're yelling at each other. She takes out a knife, cuts the orange in half, gives one half to one daughter and one half to the other daughter. One daughter takes the peel off, throws it away, and eats the fruit. Her interest was the fruit. She likes oranges. The other daughter takes the peel off, throws away the fruit, and uses the peel to bake a cake. She had a recipe that needed orange
mm,
peel. And so in this case, their interests were complementary. Their positions were they both wanted the
mm,
orange. But if they would have talked about why they wanted the orange, they would have been able to have an even better solution. And I find that that is not the exception. That's usually the rule. It's easy to find complementary interests. People often ask where to start in a negotiation. I'll say, figure out what you have in common and talk about where you coincide and maybe complement and what's important to you. And so that was one of the main concepts of that book. I'll just mention one more in the interest of time. One is that you need to separate out the people from the problem. So, what does that mean? Often in negotiations that go south, that go poorly, we're attacking people and not sort of looking at their worth as a person separate from the thing they are advocating for. And so, again, to stick with politics, which seems to be just front page of the news in the US all the time now, we're finger pointing, we're
Mm.
blaming, we're judging. All you have to do to be depressed and need medication immediately is listen to cable news, right? I mean, it's just awful. And it's just advocacy. There is no balance, there's no complexity, there's no nuance. And so let's put ourselves in the shoes of someone that's planning to vote for former President Trump. Um, you probably have I, as a person who's more liberal, probably have all kinds of things in common with that person. And I might not agree with their views, I might not agree with who they vote for, but I can find all kinds of things in common. And so think of negotiation as a lifelong journey to build relationships. Now,
Mm.
if I would have called the class at Stanford relationship building, would you have signed up?
Mm. Probably not. Probably
Probably
not.
not.
I don't know.
Probably not. Probably not. Or how to communicate better in relationships. That would get a different category of students than negotiation. Negotiation sounds awesome. It's sexy. It's getting stuff done. It's conflict. But what did I teach you in class? Relationship management. That's what it is.
Mhm.
Negotiation is fundamentally about relationships. And
Mm.
so Roger really introduced that idea of the tactical approaches, the game theory approaches, while very interesting intellectually, aren't very practical.
Mm.
Emotional intelligence, Daniel Goleman's book, I mean, that one is so important. A term that emerged from that book was EQ. No one talked about
Mhm.
EQ before that book. And it turns out that we don't measure that. When we're evaluating
Mm.
people, whether it's test scores to get into college or even as employees, historically we haven't measured that. When in fact, that's the good stuff. That's the more complex stuff. The reason that I wasn't interested while I was a business school student and going to work at McKinsey or Goldman Sachs is the jobs were fairly analytical. And I just sort of
Mm.
felt like any monkey that's trained analytically can do that job. But, can you go down and meet with the guerrilla leaders and solve the problem between them and the paramilitaries? That requires high EQ and emotional intelligence. So I think
Mm.
that both Roger introducing negotiation to the popular audience and Daniel Goleman introducing emotional intelligence and EQ to a popular audience, neither one of them were original ideas, by the way. They
Mm.
popularized things that were important. And the popularization shouldn't be discounted. Okay.
Mm.
And those books were both just revolutionary in how they got people to think about things. Difficult Conversations was written by some colleagues of mine that I worked with at Harvard. And I remember when they were writing that book and they were up at late at night and we were kind of all brainstorming examples to use. And I thought to myself, I don't see this as a big seller. I just think this is too touchy feely. And so I was really, really wrong about
Mm.
that. It's been phenomenally successful and I do use it in my class. The fundamental thing that they teach there is that relationships don't go easily all the time. Nobody has a marriage, for example, that is conflict free. And an idea that Roger introduces about conflict is constructive. Conflict isn't necessarily pejorative. How you engage in conflict, that's really, the ticket. And so what they did with difficult conversations is said, you're going to have some difficulties with the people you deal with, whether it's a spouse, a child, a boss, a subordinate, a government leader. How do you practically bring up tough stuff?
Mm.
And they give tools in there and frameworks that are extremely useful in how
Mm.
to develop those kind of skills so that you won't be afraid. The reason that people tend to not have difficult conversations isn't because they don't think about them. It isn't because they don't want them resolved. It's because they don't know how to do it. And so that book's
Mhm.
for how do you actually bring up a difficult thing and have it go well. So
It's
I'd advocate
sorry. I
those.
was just sorry to go for it. I'll let you finish.
We can either talk about those three books or I bring up the ones that I'm using in addition these days.
I just want to mention one of the standout frameworks from difficult conversations that has stuck with me to this day. That is the ladder of inference,
Hmm.
and the idea that you want to go from most objective to most personal, or most you to have the conversation about the facts, then have the conversation about the feelings, and then finally the conversation about identity. And if you start with the identity, you're prone to anchoring, you're prone to not, you're not going to be able to move in the conversational space to drive progress forward. But you can probably agree about what happened. Okay, and then you could probably agree about how that made you feel and how warranted you were in feeling that way, and then negotiate about how you can go about resolving the problem together. I thought that was fantastic. I mean, that in and of itself is just such a good, and we're faced with these all the time. Like, it's almost like life goes in these like chunks of rapid change and then stability, and by the time you realize you're stuck in a stability point, you're gonna have to have one of these difficult conversations, and most probably with yourself. And I just thought I'd call that out because it was very, one of those few books that had one thing that you can take to the touchdown line, and it's great. But now I want to hear about the new books because I'm excited to hear what I've been missing out on.
It's always interesting to hear what students remember. Not surprisingly, I hear from students frequently, and I frequently ask them, "What do you remember?" And you brought up two or three memories, and so it's really fun. I'm gonna send an email to Sheila and Bruce and Doug, who wrote that book, and say, "Hey, a student of mine who's doing this really interesting project in science fiction remembers these things, and they impacted them. So they're gonna love that. So thank you for making their day."
Of course.
Um, I'll tell you that the most frequent response, just on that topic, when I see a student, I'll say, "Hey,
Mm.
what do you remember?" I would say the most frequent response I get is the following. It's discouraging. You say, I don't really remember that much, but I remember that guy that took advantage of me in that one exercise. So
Lesson learned.
another nail in the coffin for be careful of taking advantage of people. They have long memories. They're going to come back and get you. And I would say that just on that topic, you see people over and over again. I could give 100 examples right now of people I had tough interactions with, assumed it would be the only time I ever saw them, and then we were together again in a room. Let me just give one quick story. I think you've heard this one, but um, so I dated a woman. It's a very personal story. I think I was 30, she was 24, 25, and I was in love. And she was less so. She liked me. I loved her. And but I managed to persuade her to keep dating me. It was always a little imbalanced, but I thought I could persuade her. I really would have married her. And we've been dating for 8 months, and I was thinking it's getting more and more serious. I didn't want to push too hard because I thought she'd, kind of be repelled by that. And then one night, out of the blue, she called me, and she said, "Can you believe she did this over the phone?" She said, "I've decided I don't want to date you anymore. I'm finished. Please don't call me." And she did that not in a very gentle way. She knew how
Mm,
serious I was about her, and it was just hard. It was sort of
mm,
the definition of heartbreak. I
mm.
didn't eat for more than a week. I was, drinking only. I was getting weak. I couldn't go to work. I really was just devastated by this breakup. And that just person I thought I was going to marry and be with forever has just rejected me in a harsh way. So it took me a while to get over that, but of course I did. I'm here to tell the tale. Um, Fast forward 17 years. I get an email from her, or a social media post on Facebook, just checking in with me randomly. I hadn't had any contact with her in 17 years. I was so curious. I said, "Gosh, I wonder why she's reaching out to me." And we had sent a few, I think it was Facebook Messenger back and forth, and we then jumped on the phone. And I should have known why would she reach out to me? She's getting a divorce, and it's like, wow, okay, that's interesting. She's getting divorced, and I didn't have any interest in dating her at that point, and but I was curious, wanted to get together and just kind of compare notes. So we got together and went for a hike. And about an hour into that hike, I was like, "Oh my gosh, I loved her before. I still love her. I think I'm going to marry her."
Mm,
And I did marry her, and
mm.
we had this great, great relationship. But we chuckle now about how badly she treated me, thinking that was the last phone call we'd ever have. And I try not to remember reminder of this too frequently, but we're happily married many years later. So whatever you think about your current feelings or relationship towards another person, assume you'll see them again, and you might be married to them.
It's so great. Um, no, and I think that's why, well, it sticks with. I think this is why the material sticks. I think that if you apply the stuff in your personal life, and I was fortunate enough to do it, it's something that like I keep looking for excuses to revisit, and having this conversation is a fruit of that.
Yeah.
Um, and it's awesome. I mean, like I can't imagine one dimension of my life that hasn't been improved by this toolbox. What are some of the other tools that I didn't get to know because of the continuous improvement in the course?
Yeah, I'm gonna answer your former question first. I didn't touch on it when you asked. I'm gonna give you the other books that I'm currently using in the class. Here on my desk. Let me pull them out. The first one, Michael Sandel, who's one of my professors at
Mm.
Harvard, and just he has an online course called Justice. It's free that I would recommend to anybody. His,
So good. It's so good.
he's so good. But his book, The Tyranny of Merit: Can We Find the Common Good, is an excellent book, and I use that. Jonathan Haidt. I don't know if you're familiar with Jonathan Haidt, but
Mm-hmm.
he's written multiple books. The Righteous Mind: Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. So I use that one
Mm.
in my class. And then there's a former rabbi. He's actually passed away. He was I think the lead rabbi in England, Jonathan Sachs. His book Morality is a book I use. I just
Mm.
feel like there's a real need to teach morality these days.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, I think we're having a hard time being grounded in morality. Institutions that historically taught morality, churches would
Mm-hmm.
be an example. It's not popular to talk about morality in schools anymore. Things like civics,
Mm.
for example, aren't taught as much
Mm.
as they were. And so I just feel a real, as an educator, obligation to teach moral frameworks and problem solving skills so we can work out these differences. So when something
Mm-hmm.
like Israel Palestine happens, that we solve those things not just militarily and through force, or when two parties disagree on immigration policy. I think there ought to be ways of working through those things, and empathy, and teaching empathy for the other side are key things that I teach that I might not have focused on so much 10 years ago. In
Mm.
terms of other tools, I would say that, back to the cocktail party conversation of what do I think are the kind of five things. And this one's not going to be particularly satisfying because everyone shrugs when I say this, but it's being an intense listener. Can you
Mm.
go into a conversation not only planning strategically to listen, and listening, people think of listening skills as, oh, I want to make the other side feel like I'm listening. And that's
Mm.
obviously defeating the purpose. But going in with the intention of learning. So I always go into negotiations and conversations thinking, what do I not know? What could I potentially learn from them that might either help me expand the pie, help me be more empathetic, help me have a better relationship, as opposed to what we tend to do, which is try to persuade others that we're right and they're wrong. And that just
Mm.
doesn't go anywhere. Roger Fisher had this saying about this that I used to love, which was, most of the time the solution isn't the answer. And he would
Mm.
say things like, nothing that's measurable is important. Okay. You tell that to a
Mm.
Google engineer and it's anxiety. And everything that's important is measurable. But if you really ask someone, what are the most important things to you in
Mm.
life? They're not going to be measurable. David Brooks, who I think we discussed in your class, I've always been a big fan of the New York Times columnist
Mm-hmm.
David Brooks. He wrote a book where he talks about resume virtues versus eulogy virtues. And the
Mm-hmm.
resume virtues are the kind of things that get you a job at Google. You're a smart kid from Stanford and you know computer science, and you could do a great job with that. But guess what? No one's going to talk about that at your funeral. At your funeral, the eulogy virtues are, how are you in relation to others? Who are the people? No one talks about at your funeral how much money you have, or how you became the great capitalist. It's going to be all relationship stuff and how you treated other people. And so I think that we've got to teach that. I think we've got to focus
Mm.
on teaching morality and not being afraid. Um, I don't mean too much to keep coming back to this example, but it's on my mind because I spend a lot of time in Israel, both living and working, and so that part of the world is very dear to me,
Mm.
and tremendous empathy. with both Israelis and
Mm,
Palestinians. We've spent
mm,
lots of time with both. But what we have to do is recognize that there isn't good and bad in those cultures. Those are
mhm,
complex cultures with multiple identities, and that the only way the one project I did there where we had some success, we were mediating a dispute between Israel and Jordan on water right to the Jordan River. And so people
mm,
ask me, like, what's the hardest thing you worked on? And there are a lot of different answers to that. But one of them is if you take an identity like religion, people feel strongly. Like that's a
mm,
big identity. Take a natural resource like water, people feel really strongly. So you combine those two things together, that's a tough negotiation. We were able to get a settlement there. And one of the things that we found was that generationally, younger people tended to have more friends. So, for example, um, Arab Palestinians that live in Israel, and there are a lot of them, they tended to, the younger they were, have more Israeli friends, more Jewish Israeli
mm,
friends. And some of the older people just had a hard time breaking out of their,
mm,
stereotyped identities of the other. But I've never found people that I couldn't find common interests with. I've
mm,
never found people that I couldn't identify with. The conflict you alluded to before in Colombia, it was my first big one that I worked on. And I was 28 years
mm,
old and just really getting my feet wet. And there I was flying around in a helicopter, meeting with guerrilla
mm,
leaders, taken in blindfold. It was high drama stuff. And you'd meet with these people. And I remember the first time I camped out in a guerrilla camp for 3 days with these guys, camping out. And by the end of it, I was just like, these guys are the greatest. I'm just having the best time with
mhm,
them. They're so human because I was
mm,
breaking bread and sitting down and talking to them and realizing that in that specific conflict at that time, it was mainly they had no water and they felt like the government was doing a bad job and not, giving them water. It's like, well, that's easy to empathize with. It's hard to get along without water. And I'm not trying to simplify that overall conflict, but, you know, there are many, many, many conflicts in Colombia, and guerrilla is sort of a generalized term that tends to put people in a box.
mm,
Same thing exists in Israel Palestine. So if you're an Israeli, are there Palestinian terrorists? Absolutely. If you're a
mhm,
Palestinian, are there Israeli terrorists? Absolutely. Are both sides
mhm,
right? Absolutely. And
mhm,
so there isn't a right or wrong about that conflict, but
mhm.
we need to figure out um, how not to have as many people die as we're trying to work through the conflict. I just think that loss of life is the highest moral thing that we can measure, and that we
Mm.
should all be, independent of our political views, trying to minimize loss of life.
There was another part of the class that I remember too, was that you were comparing how different the headlines looked from the boots on the ground action, and that you were sort of just saying that by the time you're talking about these, like, either big bills that need to be pushed through Congress, and like the nitty gritty of what's stopping the bill from going through is like some petty detail that's related to very like localized things, or like in the case of conflict resolution, it may be very unexpected things that end up making the difference. um, and so it's funny, I just been thinking about the fact that, like, when we look at media coverage about something that is within our area of expertise, we can very easily see where they are mistaken, or where the bias is, or where, it's much easier if you're expert on something and they're talking about that and they're doing a bad job. However, we don't do the logical next step of then assuming that those inconsistencies will probably be there for everything that I don't know. If they're there for the things that I know, why would they all of a sudden be gone for everything else? So how do we deal with that as people that are faced with like an overload of information? We have conflicting sources, conflicting ownership, conflicting all the web of influence that's going on to how information gets distributed in the world. How do you suggest, or what is like a little mnemonic device that we can have, so when we consume information, we take into account that it's part of this much broader context and not necessarily the truth per se?
Yeah, let me go in reverse order there, and I'm going to give a little middle-aged commercial against social media.
Mm.
So, warning. Um, so, look, when you're getting your information through either social media, cable news, anything that is siloed and targeted, which is companies like your former employer interested in doing and promoting that, and Facebook is become, you know, evil's an overused word in Silicon Valley, but I might use it for Facebook and Google these days.
Hmm.
They've essentially just become, ad boards, not real technology companies. And I feel like you just got to be aware of what's influencing you. And so, um, on the book recommendation front, I've read a lot of things about, starting in the '80s, I started reading Neil Postman, who wrote a book called Amusing Ourselves to Death. It was really about television and the impact of that screen. But a really nice one for your listeners to read on this is called Stolen Focus by Johann Hari. That's a really good book on this. And so what you want to do is realize that you are being biased, and it's in social media companies' interest to have you be biased, have you be angry, have you react. And so, that's on the one hand old news, but it's in the category of people know what to do, but they don't do it. So when you talk to
Hmm.
people in Silicon Valley that work at, say, Facebook, I was talking to a friend, a very senior person at Facebook recently, and she said, "Oh yeah, my best friends at Facebook, none of us let our kids use social media because we just, see how
Hmm.
bad it is for people." And so, you know, Facebook and Google, they're the new cigarette companies. They're the new big tobacco.
Hmm.
They are the evil companies, and they're really destroying a generation of people.
Hmm.
And I just think it's tragic. So you have to get a hold of that and be strategic about how you access screens, not
Hmm.
reactive, whether that's putting time limits, etc. So we could do another hour on that. In terms of the first part of your comment slash question, um, yeah, I was shocked when I would be interviewed on these conflicts when I was abroad, reading about it the next day in the paper. I just couldn't believe it. I was like, wait, I just gave that interview, and that is not even remotely related to what I said, and I was being quoted.
Hmm.
And that was in the days where all the major newspapers had bureaus in places like Bogota,
Hmm.
and these days they don't even have that. A great example of that's the war right now in Israel. So
Hmm.
it's very difficult for non-Palestinian reporters to be in Gaza. Okay,
Hmm.
all kinds of reasons for that. We can go into that. But if you don't have reporters
Hmm.
from other countries there, what we're hearing isn't always very objective, right?
Hmm.
So, because the economic model, that's not the reason they're not there, but in general, the economic model for newspapers has just been
Hmm.
decimated, right? It doesn't
Hmm.
work. You can't have people, doing good foreign policy journalism abroad. One or two papers can afford to do that. Maybe the New York Times, maybe the Washington Post. So anyway, that's a whole problem. But I think being strategic about how you access information rather than reactive is the key.
Hmm.
And I'd say if you just write off cable news and social media as access points, that's a good start.
Hmm. Yeah, it's a tall order. I mean, there's so much information to sift through, and there's like a part of me that's always tempted to eat more information to figure out what the signal is in the noise. And so I have to always be playing this game of like saying, how does this information fit with my model of the world? Do I need to update my model of the world a lot for this to be true? And oftentimes it's a good metric, but oftentimes you find these little niches that's where you end up in the trap anyway, where it's like, oh, I don't want to change my model of the world, thus what I'm seeing is false. Um, no, it's fascinating stuff. I think for the first time, I actually feel like the tide has shifted from traditional media into the new media of Facebook and TikTok and Twitter and all these things. And I think we're beginning to see the effects of this as it coincides with AI, becoming really proficient at language, as it coincides with all the geopolitical tension, the macroeconomic uncertainty. So it is somewhat unsettling, but I do think that there is enough encouragement to be had in the fact that we can always figure out something. Like we can always make one marginal improvement toward the truth, and I think that is most days most of what we can do. But that's probably enough. Like it's one foot in front of the other to get to a more cohesive model of how we should get along with each other. What
Yeah,
are
if you take
Sorry,
that
go for it.
principle, if you take the principle of going back to questioning your assumptions, how do you do that? So I, for a couple of years, would, and some of my biases and viewpoints probably are transparent through this podcast. But I thought, it's really hard for me to relate to the Fox News crowd. So I need to listen to it. I need to understand their
Mm.
perspective. But I realized after doing that for maybe a year that it wasn't it wasn't the useful conservative perspective that could help my thinking. It was a lot of barking,
Mm.
and that's why I'm so down on cable news. And so you
Mm.
have to decide, how do you get information that is in conflict with your current views, and where do you go for the good stuff, right?
Mhm.
And that's the key. Is everyone should be on a journey to get disconfirming data
Mm.
from the internet, because that's going to be the easiest way to do it, that makes you question your assumptions. And so
Mm.
who are the friends that you can have that push your thinking?
Mm.
And if all of your friends are, in my case, um, white 60-year-olds that grew up in the suburbs of Arizona, that's a pretty limiting view. And so I
Mm.
would just make a strong, strong argument for diversity in relationships. And I would say one that really, we focus a lot on racial diversity,
Mm.
but that's only one kind of diversity, and it's a good
Mm.
one, a good lens to look through. But I would say an economic diversity lens is important.
Mm.
I would
Mhm.
say an age diversity lens is important. So I
Mm.
have two very good friends of mine. We're both in their 80s, and I learned so much from these guys. They're both men,
Mm.
and I've traveled with them and done all kinds of things with them. My best friend in my neighborhood is 38, and I just find that there are things that I can learn from those guys that are really different than people that are just like me.
Mm.
Um, all of those people are male and they're white, but they bring such different perspectives based on age. And so I just
Mm.
say I would include age diversity to the many important diversities to get a balanced perspective on the world.
Mhm. And to close out, what's a story that comes to mind when thinking about a negotiation that could have gone horribly wrong, but instead ended up with that warm feeling of maybe we do got this as a species?
I'm going to tell a family story. The family
Mm.
stories are always, when I first started teaching, I used to tell my heroic negotiation stories where I came in, I solved some big problem. And as soon as I realized that that was less effective as a teaching tool and to tell some of my failures and my personal stuff, students like that much more. And
Mm.
so I'm going to tell one that partially failure, partially success. So um, the woman I married, Kathy, that I referred to earlier, had two children from a previous marriage. And the daughter, when we got married, was 13.
Mm.
And um, I was asked to go speak on a cruise. It was a Stanford Alumni Association cruise in the Mediterranean. I got this email saying, we want you and a partner to come on this cruise, and you just have to speak on the boat one night, and we'll pay for two business class plane tickets. The cruise is paid for. You just have to speak one night. And I thought, I'm going to see if my 13-year-old stepdaughter will go with me.
Mm.
And so I showed her the picture of the boat, the cruise, and she said, let's go. And so my wife, Kathy, thought it was a terrible idea to be alone on a boat with a girl and,
Mm.
going from France to Greece
Mm.
and stopping in Turkey at the end. But we went. And it was sort of not
Mm.
for the faint of heart, traveling with a 13-year-old girl who really didn't like me very much and was my stepdaughter. And she behaved badly for much of the trip, and there was a lot of tension, which wasn't the way I was hoping that it would go. And she was just doing things that I saw as like way out of bounds for what
Mm.
a child should do, with a parent. In case she hears this, I'll spare you the examples, but there was some tough stuff. And my thought, and this is most step parents think, oh my gosh, this kid is really disrespectful and really not nice and really not grateful. And if I'd been the parent the whole time, they'd be much different. It's the other parent's fault. Like that would never be my kid.
Mm.
And so I decided, rather than try to discipline her or teach her, I would just let a lot of stuff go and try to build the relationship, because this is a long term game. She's going to be my
Mm.
daughter. And so, but the stuff was bothering me that she was
Mm.
doing. And so I wanted to let my wife know when we got back, hey, your daughter really is a
Mm.
bad kid. And she does all these horrible things. And you ought to know some of the things she said and did with me. So I bit my tongue and kept notes on my phone. So the
Mm.
final night, we were having dinner, the two of us, at a restaurant in Istanbul. And we sit down, and she's 13, right?
Hmm.
We've got a nice table overlooking the Bosphorus River. I thought we'd look at some photos, maybe do some Instagram posts on our Instagram site, how great this trip was, and talk about the good times and not really
Hmm.
focus on some of the bumps we'd had along the way. And so we sat down, and she, in a very businesslike way, said to me, Stan, I have something I'd like to bring up with you that's a little awkward. I said, okay, Jane, sure, anything. We could talk about anything. You know, my style is really open. Let's talk. And she said, yeah, I just want to know why you keep creepy notes about me on your phone. And I've almost never felt worse in my life. My heart went into my stomach somewhere. I was like, oh my gosh. She got on my phone. She found these notes that I was writing down to remember some of the bad stuff so I could tell my wife. And it was bad. I mean, these things were written not for her consumption. And, there were probably 35 things that I'd written down. So I
And
didn't
these were
feel it.
also notes for yourself to then relay verbally, so that you weren't
Correct.
going to share the notes. Oh man. Oh
This is,
boy.
and they're written in frustration. There's some
Yeah.
heavy language that might have
Hmm.
been inappropriate. It was inappropriate. Um, so I thought quickly and I said, Jane, I said, look, you know my style. I want to be open. I want to be transparent. I wrote these down because I wanted to have a conversation with your mom. I didn't want to ruin the trip disciplining you. But these are some things that are, just outside of what I want the norm for our family to be. And so let's just go through the notes. Let's just, one by one, I'll say why I wrote that down, what I was going to say to your mom, and just be really transparent about it. And so
Hmm.
she said, okay, let's hear let's go. I want to hear. So it's been a long time, but I'll mention a couple of them that I remember. So the first note, actually, she and I had gotten in an argument in a Paris bookstore. She's 13, and she picked out a book. I wanted to buy her a book, English speaking bookstore, and it was a biography of a French serial killer. It was like a 400-page footnoted biography, not the thing a 13-year-old should be reading, traveling with her stepdad in Europe. And I just said, no, Jane, you can't read that book. And she said, yes, I can. It's my own money. I can do whatever I want. You can't tell me what to do. And she had a little temper tantrum.
Hmm.
And it got so bad that I grabbed her by the arm, not too forcefully, and I just escorted her out of the bookstore. I said, young lady, we're leaving here. And as we're leaving, she's like, don't touch me. And some guy said, is that your real dad? And it was just this huge meltdown. So
Ooh.
that's an ugly experience. And so I wanted to remember it. So the note that I wrote down on the phone was Jane obsessed with serial killers. And so it just went downhill from there. But we went through all the notes. And by the end of it, we were laughing. And then we sent some Instagram photos anyway. And, just
Hmm.
getting that stuff out in the open. It was obviously a mistake on my part. And I think that one thing that I teach in my class that you may or may not remember is we under apologize. All of us make mistakes. All of us do things that are in offense to others, intentionally or not. And when you apologize, it diffuses the situation largely. And so I apologized to her and said, Jane, I wrote a lot of these in a state of heavy emotion. I'm trying to figure out how to be a stepdad. I'm failing. And then what's her response if I say that? What would you guess her response is if I say I'm failing as a stepdad? I'm sorry.
There's like the emotional. Wait a minute, maybe it's like I haven't been as good as I could be, or like there's the
Exactly.
reflexive.
So that's exactly right. And so people tend to do one of two things. They own their contribution to the problem, which is what you very articulately said. And then they also have empathy for you. No, you're not a terrible stepdad. No, this has been a great trip. Because obviously the trip had ups and downs. And it wasn't as easy as I thought. And my wife was right. And I was wrong. She knew that would be a hard experience with a 13-year-old stepdaughter who I didn't know very well. And it was, me being overconfident in my abilities. But we look at that now, she's 24, 11 years later, and it was a bonding experience. The day to day was tough. It wasn't all, complimenting each other. But, if you don't do the hard stuff, you never develop. And so let's end with that what we want to do, whether it's through having difficult negotiations or negotiations with other people, is realize that we're trying to make the world a better place. We're trying to expand the pie. We're trying to, in the case of war, have fewer deaths. In the case of the economy, make more money and deliver better products and services. In the case of families, have better long term relationships. all of which are based in empathy. And we have to understand that the world is complex. We can't put people in neat little boxes and judge them and then try to persuade them that they're wrong. We have to take the opposite approach. And if we give people the tools through teaching negotiation and conflict resolution, the world and the family and the company and the government is all going to be more effective.
Mhm. Fantastic. Stan, thank you so much for your time. It's been great. I look forward to keeping in touch.
I've enjoyed it, Christian. Thanks.